Listen up. There's no more excuses.
We're empowering those who want the hustle by exposing the status quo.
The days of ordinary are over.
It's time to crush mediocrity and start discovering your greatest potential.
Welcome to the Hustle Nation. To the Hustle Nation. To the Hustle Nation. To the Hustle Nation.
Welcome back to another episode of the Hustle Nation podcast. Today, we've got Scott Harvey in the house. Scott is a highly sought-after speaker, coach, and business communications consultant who helps individuals and organizations communicate through any situation. Since launching Speaking of Harvey Incorporated in 2010, Scott has had the opportunity to speak and train organizations from Kentucky to Indonesia. He also hosts the Speaking of Harvey podcast. As a former FBI-trained hostage negotiator and public information officer, Scott knows what it means to speak up when lives are on the line. He's passionate about helping others build the skills and confidence to move off the sidelines and to lead the conversation. Scott can be found giving his heart and wisdom to help teens navigate communicating in an online world and to prevent tragedy before it happens, something he became passionate about in his years as a DARE officer. He lives in central Kentucky with his wife of 25 years and his two daughters. Scott, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm super excited to be here.
We're excited to have you here. We're excited to talk about the wonderful bourbon of Kentucky, maybe. And I want to know about the FBI-trained hostage negotiation stuff. That sounds interesting, but welcome.
Yeah.
We're excited to have you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So tell us a little bit more about who you are and how you got here.
Yeah, I am a speaker, coach, and an author today. But prior to that, I spent 20 years as a city police officer. Now, I did all of my training for the hostage negotiator stuff through the FBI. I went through several FBI courses on that because at the time, not a lot of state level agencies were training in hostage negotiations. But I got involved in that for the same reason I got involved in DARE. Like I got into police work to help people. And I realized that police are largely a cleanup based business. We get called after the tragedy. And I didn't like that because, you couldn't put Humpty Dumpty back together again when you got called to the scene. And so I got prevention focused and I started teaching DARE. I started getting trained as a negotiator so that I could help people stop a poor situation from getting worse. And I just realized later on in my career that everything I was doing was communication focused. I was talking to the media. I was doing public information officer stuff. I was negotiating with hostage takers or suicidal people. I was teaching and running our Citizens Police Academy. I was doing all of these things that were prevention focused, but they were also communication based. And so that's when I started kind of realizing, hey, I can retire from police work at 43 years old because when I signed in at 23, I was signing into a 20-year retirement. It's 25 today, but I was grandfathered into that. And I realized I needed another gig. Like I needed something to step into if I was going to retire at 43 because the pension is nice. It's a good safety net. It's not a way to raise a family. And I realized that. I'm thankful for it, but it wasn't plan A. And so with about 8 years left, I started speaking at conferences and things like that I was already attending for the police department. I got to know the organizers, started speaking there. And it was at those events that the participants in my trainings were like, hey, would you come and train our staff? I'm like, sure, I'll come train your staff. These were school administrators, principals, things like that. I was like, sure, I'll come train your staff. Well, then the staff was like, hey, would you come and speak to our students? Like, well, yeah, you have to pay for my gas, that kind of stuff. Like, I didn't know really how this worked, right? So we made it happen. And then as the snowball rolled over, every year it just kept picking up more snow. I started doing more presentations. And I realized that I just really enjoyed speaking. I loved communicating for a living. I realized it was an actual job. Most people, when they attend conferences, don't realize there's such a thing as a professional speaker. They just think the organizers knew some friends who got on the stage and did this. These guys, which is how I started, to be fair. The conference organizer was like, hey, somebody backed out. Can you help a brother out? I'm like, I'm in. So, and then realized it was an actual legit job. So I started speaking professionally and used vacation time from the police department to speak more and more. The last year before I retired, 2017, I actually did 77 presentations while still working full time at the police department. So
Wow.
it was most of those were school assemblies. So you're looking 3 or 4 in a typical day, but it was a lot and it really wasn't that scalable. And I realized once I could retire, I could do some things to make it a little bit more scalable. So that's where we are today. Since I retired, I added coaching, I facilitate a mastermind, I do a podcast, I wrote a book, just doing everything I can to teach as many of these principles to as many people as I can, because I know they work. I know these communication tactics work in a high pressure situation like a hostage negotiation. They're going to work in your business. They're going to work in your family. They've been tested and they're not complicated. That's why I love this stuff.
So Scott, what are some of those?
Yeah.
Some of the things when we're dealing with a crisis situation, the reason I wrote the book, and I don't want to, it's not just to push the book. This is part of my story. The reason I wrote the book is we in the corporate world, especially when things get weird or crazy, or we've had a product fail, or we've had an HR issue, we shut down communications. And that doesn't kill the story, right? The lawyers tell us, you can't talk about this. Don't talk about this. And I love a bunch of lawyers, but man, they err on the side of caution, right? And I tell people all the time, there's not a situation where you can't say anything. There are things you shouldn't say. But the problem is when you say nothing, silence without rapport feels like we don't care every time. And the listening people, whether those are your employees or your customers, they'll fill in the narrative. They'll come up with a reason for why you're not saying anything, and it'll be way worse than what the actual problem was. So
Lots of assumptions, right?
a lot of assumptions, because our brain has to make sense of it.
Yeah.
Like maybe my supervisor quit talking to me. They're not emailing me back. They're not texting me back. I'm getting ready to be fired. Like that's the conclusion that my brain comes up with to make this make sense. The problem is once I come to that conclusion, I will find all of the things to make that make sense.
Validated.
Like, my boss parked in a different spot today. They don't even want to cross paths with me in the parking lot. Like it just, it sounds ridiculous to say that, but our brain does that in the silence. And so I just spend a lot of my time encouraging people to have conversations, even if they're uncomfortable, especially if they're uncomfortable, because we live in a world today that is quick to cancel people when they say the wrong thing. And so really good-hearted people are saying nothing because they don't want to offend. And their silence comes across as more offensive than if they had said the wrong thing, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. So Scott, how does that tie into, when you talk about the hostage negotiation or really, in those situations, you're dealing with somebody they're in their own cycle, they're on their own spin, right? Like,
yes.
So how do you, when you're having those conversations, how do you kind of balance the, not being silent and talking, but, kind of tapping into, what cycle they're going through?
A couple of things just in basic communication. And that's what I teach people is basics of communication, because they work everywhere, including the hostage negotiation situation. But you're not going to convince somebody outside of their reality. Like if they believe this thing, it doesn't really matter what the facts are. What matters is that they believe it. And if they believe it, that's where we have to come at it from. We're not going to, the sky is purple. I'm not going to argue with you about what color the sky is. Cool. Like we can push past that. That's how you see it. So not trying to argue facts with somebody who is looking at it from a different lens as you are. Don't try to convince somebody outside of their reality. Don't play into it. Don't talk about the purple sky, but it's not something you're going to have to convince them otherwise in order to continue the conversation. So, don't try to talk them out of their reality. And then the other one, the key piece for any type of communication is I've never talked somebody into doing what I need them to do, but I have listened people into doing what I need them to do, meaning I'm asking questions, open-ended questions. I'm actually paying attention. I'm actively listening, and I'm finding out what are their desires, what are their issues, what are their frustrations. And then I craft a solution that allows them to save as much face as possible. Like knowing that your family is important to you. How do we get out of this situation to where your family realizes, hey, they made a poor choice, but then they fixed it. Like then they made it better. Like we can't undo the past. But knowing what you value, what's important to you, that kind of stuff, it allows me to get you to a place where we can get you out of this situation in a way that makes sense for you. And I don't get to provide those. I don't get to decide what's important for you, what you value, all of that stuff. I have to get that from you.
Excellent.
So you're doing a lot of asking questions and repeating the things that you heard them say they want.
Yes. Active listening is huge. And that's something that we're lacking today. And I'll be honest with you, I struggle with it in the day-to-day world. I'm easily distracted. And I say things to my wife all the time. And I'm like, I didn't realize you even said that. Like I responded, but I couldn't tell you what you said. Like, so I'm guilty of this. I'm preaching to myself. But when we're actively listening, we are giving minimal encouragers. We're nodding our heads. We're saying yes. We're saying, and then what? That type of stuff. We're paraphrasing back to them. To your point, Chris, we're repeating back what we heard. And that allows it to do two things. One, it shows them we were listening. And two, it allows them to clarify if we're wrong. Because if you're an external processor like me, the first 3 or 4 sentences out of my mouth have nothing to do with my problem. I'm just externally processing, right? And when you repeat those back to me, I'm like, that's not the problem at all. And then I'll get to the problem, right? But if you repeat back to me, it allows you clarify for understanding, and it allows me to know you're for sure listening to me. Emotional labeling, saying things like, well, that sounds frustrating. I can see where that might make you angry, that type of stuff. It gives them handles for that emotion and allows them to move right through it, right?
Scott, I went through a sales program years ago. It was pretty interesting because we learned some of these tactics that you're referencing in a totally different capacity, of course. And one of the tools that the instructor would often use was when you would say something in depth, she would repeat and say, what I heard you say was X. She'd break it down in her own words, paraphrasing, as you say. And then you had your opportunity to say, well, you missed this, or you missed that. You kind of validate that. And it always felt like this individual cared, even though this was really all just a part of the training and the program. I'm sure she did care, by the way.
Yes.
But it was very interesting. And that was a takeaway to me. And I've used that. And then, like you said, people have their chance to clarify, and it shows you're actively listening. And I think when it shows you actively listen, it shows you care. And when you care, you now have some wiggle room with this individual to kind of meet in the middle. And I think that's true in business. I have no idea if that's true in hostage negotiation because I've never done it, but yeah.
I'll tell you this, Chris, my job as a negotiator was to build rapport. It was to establish rapport with the person I'm talking to. But that's not just for negotiators. That's my job as a parent, as a husband, as a worker, as a business owner. My job is to establish rapport, because people only do business with people they like, know, and trust. The only way they get to like, know, and trust us is if we build rapport. Now, you can't be fake about it, right? Like, you can't talk about, I don't know anything about some things that people are into, but I'll ask them about it. And then I'm learning. I don't have to know what they know in order to be interested in what they are doing. So you get to a place where people like, know, and trust you. Social media helps with that a lot. I work with business owners and business leaders. They're like, I don't know what to put on there. Like, put whatever you want on there if it tells me a little bit about who you are. Because if I see pieces of me in you, it allows me to establish rapport, like, know, and trust you. Even when you mess up, that's very human. And I'm like, you know what? I messed up too. I'm going to forgive them, and we're going to continue on with our relationship. So rapport is, I said in the book, we do business at the speed of rapport. We just do. The more rapport we have, the more likely I'm going to do business with you.
So, when you talk about kind of the, likability and trust and things like that, and build that rapport, what are some ways that you found to build rapport quickly? Is it commonality? Is it, just asking them questions like people haven't been asked before? Because, to your point, it's a skill that, isn't taught in school for sure. Right. And to your point, is probably one of the most important skills you can have truly in any relationship you have.
Yeah. The quickest, easiest way to build rapport with people is to actively listen to them. In a conference setting, I love conferences as an extrovert. It has nothing to do with the people on the stage. Though as a professional speaker, I watch other speakers to see what they do, how they interact, all of that stuff. It's tricks that I learned. But at a conference, I'm connecting with people in the hallway. I'm sitting with different people at lunch. I'm having drinks with people after the conference, and I'm asking them about them. I'm resisting the urge to tell them about me, right? That's what I want to talk about. That's what I'm most comfortable talking about. But if I'm actively asking them about them, even if in a 5-minute conversation, if I do 1 minute of talking, they're going to leave that conversation thinking, that Scott guy, and I liked him, right? Because I let them talk about something they were very comfortable with, which is themselves.
Yeah.
And I make a note later on of who they are, what they do, that type of stuff, because you never know when you're going to need that guy or that gal who does that thing. And you can reach back out to them and say, hey, we met at this conference and I'm in need of this now. And I know you do that, right?
Yeah.
So I'm quick with the follow-up email. If you give me a card at a conference, I'm going to email you before the day's up. Just so we've established that contact and that communication. I'm going to say something about what we talked about, because that reminds me also, when I've met 20 other people, this is the person whose son is a communications major in college right now. Yeah. And so I'll put that in the email. That's how we establish rapport, as we listen to people.
Scott, how does this translate to social media? So I wonder, for coaches and consultants who want to build their business, maybe small businesses, they listen to this and they say, yeah, I totally hear what you're saying. And I think almost anybody listening should be able to resonate with this message. How does this, and what can someone do to improve their presence on social media? And I feel like I could answer this, but you're the guest.
Yeah, no, that's fair. And I think, to me, one of the biggest problems with social media today is we're actually training people to not listen. As we scroll very quickly, I read the first 3 or 4 words. I'm not interested. I move on. I listen to the first 2 or 3 words of your reel. I move on. I'm just not listening. If you really want to engage in social media, resist the urge to talk. Just listen, see what's going on. Then maybe engage in the conversation, but not in how you can help. Because that's what we want to do. We promote our business. Like, here's how I can help you with XYZ. But just say, hey, congratulations. Way to go on that thing that you did. That you and your daughter look like you had a great time on daddy-daughter night. Good for you. Like, you're just encouraging and doing those type of engagements with people. And then if somebody asks and says, hey, I'm having a problem with this, what do you suggest? I generally say something like, when I dealt with that, this is what I did. I resist the urge to say, you should do this. I'm like, this is what I did, and this is how it worked out for me. Happy to help you if I can. Like, that's how I leave things. I just let them know what I did in that situation and how it played out for me. And if they find that useful, great. If, we can take the conversation offline, which we've done more than one occasion, but just looking to connect with people and encourage people for the most part on social media. Don't get into the flame war. Somebody disagrees with what you say, I just let it go. I let it live on my post, and I just don't even say anything back. I'm not going to re-engage with people.
Scott, what about the people, though, that do jump in and they want to offer solutions, not so much to sell their business or their service to the individual, but I think a lot of people that I see do that specifically on LinkedIn or other platforms where they want to be helpful, but that's their first action. How do some people see that, even though the intentions may be very good and not to sell?
Right. That is my biggest pet peeve with LinkedIn. Is like, I have zero filter when it comes to accepting connection requests. Like, I will hit accept on all of them, because I'm a people person and I want to have the more connections I can have, the better I am, I believe, as a person. But as soon as I hit accept from about 1 out of every 5 people, I immediately get something in the inbox of LinkedIn talking about how they've made these millions and I can make these millions and that kind of stuff. And I don't get rid of the connection right away, but I ignore the message. Like, I'm not, and honestly, you're not my person. If we don't even know each other, we've not been out on a date and you want to marry me. Mm-hmm. Like, that's not a thing that we do. So I think that's why the relationship is important. That's why the engaging on people's posts, encouraging people, that kind of stuff. I talk to business owners all the time who say, I send out a newsletter and nobody reads it. Who cares? Shocker. They've not unsubscribed, right? Yeah. If they unsubscribe, that's a win, because they're not your people and you're not wasting time and effort on people who are not your people. But if they don't unsubscribe, even if they never open, you're still their guy. you're still in the back of their mind. And when they need that thing that you do, they're going to remember, oh yeah, that's what Scott does. And they'll reach out. That's one of the reasons I wrote this book and why I send it out to HR directors everywhere, because it's a business card people won't throw away. I've sent a bunch of them out. My wife's like, they're not going to read that, to HR people that I've had one conversation with. Yeah. I was like, they don't have to. It'll sit on their desk or it'll sit on their bookshelf. And when somebody comes in and says, hey, we're having communication issues here, and they're like, I know a guy, and they'll grab the book and they'll get in touch. So, whether they read it or not, it still is a valuable resource that they will need eventually, and they'll be there when they do. Because business cards from a conference, I throw them away after I've contacted the person. Book, I'm going to put on a bookshelf. I'm going to hang on to it.
Yeah. I call that proactive versus reactive marketing.
Yes. And when you order enough of them, you get such a good discount on the printing that it makes sense to send them out to people. It's a no-brainer.
So Scott, one of the things that I think is interesting just about kind of your path and your career is you had this ramp up period, really into kind of your next gig. And was there a time or a milestone along the way where you just said, man, I'm just not sure I can do this?
Yeah. Dustin, there was an 8-year ramp, using your word, 8 years of working both jobs where I could retire. And I thought, I've got some time. I can start this as a side hustle. I'm a huge fan of the side hustle. I think everybody should have one. Like that thing that you would do for free is kind of your side hustle. What's fun for you? Speaking is fun for me. I would do it for free, but thankfully I don't have to, right? People are paying me to do this. So I spent about 8 years building that ramp. And the last 6 years of working both jobs, I was up at 4 a.m, 5 days a week. And I didn't have to be at the police department till 7:30. I spent those 3 hours or so, 3 days a week. I tried to go to the gym. The other 2 weeks was just me, the computer, and a pot of coffee, just booking gigs, doing travel arrangements, emailing potential clients, all of that stuff. And what I found was that condensed into those couple of hours, I got a lot done. And I went to the police department already feeling super productive because I'd already been really productive that day. And so then I'm teaching DARE and I'm doing those things, riding that wave of getting a lot of things done. But the other side of that is I did have somebody from the police department, I still don't know who, that wrote an anonymous letter to all of our local politicians, the mayor, and the local newspaper saying that Scott was doing all of this on work time, that I was building my side hustle from my police department office, which wasn't true. But at the same time, as the public information officer and the DARE officer, like I knew all of these politicians. They're like, we know this is crap, right? This is just jealousy is what this is. Because this person didn't realize at 4 and 5 in the morning, I'm scheduling posts. I'm scheduling emails to go out. I'm getting these things done so that when I get to work, I can do work.
Yeah.
Right. So, my older brother who used to be in law enforcement and left for the private sector, he's like, man, that was the pack mentality that frustrated me. He said, anytime somebody separates themselves from the pack, they'll nip at their heels until they fall back in line. And I saw that unhealthy side of what I was doing. But at the same time, everybody else was like, good for you. Go out and do your thing. Some of the officers were working security as their off-duty job. Some of them were directing traffic at the big churches in town. So everybody had their side hustle. Mine was just, the speaking stuff.
Well, what's interesting about that is just that was such a pivotal moment where a lot of people would give up. When we talk about, what is that hustle culture and that hustle mindset, right? It's a lot of times there's always going to be somebody that's going to be giving you a reason directly or indirectly to not go towards your goals. And it's, what we see that time and time again with successful people is they have that clarity of, look, I'm not going to pay attention to the 20% that's going to try to tear me down. The reality is there's 50% that may not care one way or the other. Right. But, I'm going to focus on my goals and I'm not giving up, and I'm going to focus on them. And, even your point of, the 4 a.m., I think it's another great example of so many times people look at successful people like yourself. Right. And they're like, I want to be like Scott, I want to be like Scott, but they don't want to put in the time, energy, and effort. And this mentality of like, I want to be Scott. But I don't want to wake up at 4.
Right.
I want to
you
do
want
that.
to be him, but you don't want to do the work he's doing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And there was some of that pushback, Dustin, from, the officers that I work with when they found out what I charged for a presentation at the time. They're like, you charge that for an hour? No. I charge that for the 20 years of experience that allows me to sum this up in an hour, plus the 10 to 12 hours of booking and travel arrangements and all of this stuff, the development of this. So no, I mean, that's the rate for an hourly presentation, but it's not an hour's worth of work. And that's just somebody that doesn't understand you can't just show up and spend an hour on a stage and collect that check.
For sure.
It'd be amazing if you could. That's just not a thing.
For sure.
Yeah.
Well said.
Yeah. That's awesome. Scott, I want to go back to when you started. Most people don't have the training or the ability to go from police officer to FBI trained hostage negotiator. You kind of glazed over that a little bit. So I want to know, how did you transition into that? I know you had some training, but I'd love to hear you talk about that as well.
Yeah, I was in patrol, working patrol, like everybody starts out in police work on patrol. And I was doing that kind of stuff. And we had a SWAT team. I'm not a SWAT guy. Like I shoot because I had to. I don't shoot because it's fun for me. I mean, if you want to go out and shoot guns, we'll shoot guns. But that just means I have to clean a gun, which is my least favorite thing to do. I'm just not tactical Timmy. Like I am not anti-gun. I'm not, a huge gun collector. But I got involved in the negotiation aspect of it because if I do my job, the SWAT team doesn't have to do theirs, right? We get it to a point where everybody is safe. And I realize, even though today I still feel very confident in my skills, like I could take you down, I could subdue you if I need to. I don't want to. I'd much rather talk you out of it, right? And I talked a lot of people out of fighting me at the police department. They didn't want to go to jail. I just feel like it's a much better outcome for both of us. And so because words carry a ton of power that a lot of people don't fully understand, a lot of people didn't really understand how I geek out on this. It's a mental chess match. How do I get you to where I need you to be and make you think it's your idea? Which sounds manipulative. And people are like, well, you're just manipulating people. Yeah, so they don't get killed and they don't kill other people. So maybe, right? Now, the problem with these skills is they can be used for evil purposes. Like you can actually manipulate people with some of these skills that I teach people. But it doesn't mean the skill is the problem. The person is the problem. You say what you want about guns. It's the person that's shooting the gun that's the problem, ultimately, right? The gun is a tool. Yeah. So these are tools that I give people that they can use for really, really good things, or they can use to be that greasy manipulator salesperson that people end up hating, even though they might get the sale.
That's a great point. I mean, manipulation has always got that negative connotation, right? And to your point, manipulation in a negative sense is wrong, but persuasion and convincing and things like that, in a positive way. I mean, the alternative to that would be crazy. Imagine, what does a coach do to his players?
Yeah.
I mean, you could say he's manipulating them. Well, no, I mean, he's leading them. He's convincing them, persuading them, getting them bought in. I mean, yeah, that's leadership 101. And yes, could a coach manipulate his players in a negative way to make them do crap they shouldn't be doing? Yeah, for sure. But no, it's a good dichotomy right there.
I actually, for the last 5 years, have coached high school volleyball. I was an assistant coach on our high school volleyball team. And so we used a lot of these things with those girls because, there are times my job as the coach, I was not the X's and O's guys. I love the game. I understand the game. I'm an official, but I was the mindset guy. Like something's off with this girl. I'm going to go figure it out. Like I'm going to figure out why things aren't connecting here. And I would tell them, like, I don't decide playing time or positions, but I make sure every girl is available to play anytime the coach needs her. That was my job, which is more of the mental mindset, more of the not manipulation, but more of the negotiation that I'd built a career on. And that's what I do in corporations today. I tell them, if I can hold 1,000 middle schoolers' attention in the gym for an hour, your boardroom is not a challenge for me. Like, it's not a thing. I'm not worried.
Yeah.
Oh, that is a great challenge. Scott, have you kept track of how many hostage negotiations you've had?
True call out ones I did negotiations for about 18 of my 20 years. I didn't get into about 2 years in. And true call out negotiations could probably count on two hands, honestly. But it was the everyday side of the road negotiations with people that, keep this situation from getting worse, the negotiations in my family with my friends. And you could say I was kind of born into this. I'm the middle of 3 boys, and neither one of my brothers has ever been wrong about anything. So as the middle guy, I was the negotiator, the peacekeeper, the get things done kind of guy. But very, very few actual called out negotiations, Chris. Thankfully, where I worked, we didn't have a huge issue with this. But we would train a couple times a year and run scenarios, all that stuff in those trainings. And, the times that I was called out, 100% save record. Nobody got hurt once I established contact with people. So I'm proud of that.
That's incredible.
And I could count on one hand the number of fights I've been in at the police department, because we're going to talk our way through it first.
That's awesome. Scott, you mentioned something that Dustin and I talk a lot about, both on and off the show, which is coaching youth sports. And I actually wrote a book about mindset, and it's something that we both value a ton of because it is so critical, especially when coaching youth sports. Can you talk about maybe a scenario or two where you were able to change the game because of how you were able to help a student athlete of some sort see differently, buy in, believe?
Yeah, I had a girl, the coach and I talked. She was our Dennis Rodman, right? She was a right side hitter. She was
critical.
And the right side hitter for volleyball, they're blocking the outside hitter, which is usually your strongest hitter. So they're blocking the strongest hitter. And a right side very rarely gets to hit the ball. They're more a defensive specialist, and she loved the defense aspect of the game. She was very good at it. I called her Moose because she had the largest hands on the team. And I said, when your hands come over the net, it looks like a pair of moose antlers coming over the net. So we called her Moose, right? That was the nickname we had for her. And she came out of the game one time really mad. And I was like, what's going on? And she goes, I've not even touched the ball. She goes, I'm not contributing. I'm not helping my team. I'm like, let me tell you what you don't see. When that girl goes to swing against you, she either hits the ball long or she crams it into the net because she's scared of your ability to block. You change the game without touching the ball. If you weren't there, she'd be a way more successful hitter. Even if you never touch the ball, you make people make different decisions because they're scared of you, and that makes them a worse player. You're in their head, even though you've not, in your words, touched the ball. So I think there's ways we contribute when we're really exceptional at our game, and she doesn't see that as exceptional. Like the girl that's pounding the ball down, like there's more glory in that. I get that. It's like the offensive lineman. Like you only get yelled at if you don't do your job, right?
Yeah.
If the quarterback gets sacked, it's your fault. But if he doesn't, you've done your job. So I think letting her understand, and when we watched it on film, I said, do you see where she hit that ball long? She goes, yeah. I said, do you know why? She goes, because my hands were there. Yes, because she couldn't hit past the antlers. And so getting people to realize you don't contribute every time you touch the ball. You contribute every time you step on the court.
What's interesting to me, though, having a teenager, is that when they have those moments where they walk off the court or the field frustrated, it is really hard to get them to listen, to get them to engage.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you need to give that person a moment to calm down, or if you need to just walk away for a minute. But I'm really curious on how you would approach that, because even for adults, it is really hard to listen to anybody when you're heated.
Yes. And that's one of the things that I talk about in the book is that, stress makes communication super difficult. So the girls knew, and I'm not a guy who cusses. That's not who I am. I don't judge people who cuss. Like I've been known to, it's just not in my normal day-to-day language. But I tell those girls, I said, when I come to talk to you, if you need to cuss, drop whatever you need to drop. It's not going to bother me. Like, and I tell them, I said, I'm not going to tell your parents. I'm not going to run and say, do you know what so-and-so did? Because I get it. You're mad. Because what I need them to do is process that emotion as quickly as possible. And sometimes dropping an F-bomb when nobody's going to overhear you or something, it lets off some of that steam. So I don't judge the girls based on that. But I think some of the parents in the stands would be surprised at some of the things I've heard from some of these girls who would never say that to anybody else. But what I need them to do is process that anger and frustration as quickly as possible. And sometimes that means just saying some words you wouldn't say at church. And then they're more able to hear me say, okay, now let's work on this, this, and this, right? And a lot of times it was me saying, they're like, I crammed it into the net. Sure you did. How many thousands of balls have you hit over that net in practice on a daily basis, right? If all we focus on is the times we weren't successful, then we'll actually be less successful. As a police officer, I knew drunks hit police cars that have their lights on all the time, because the drunk can't focus on more than one thing at a time. And so when they see the car on the side of the road with the lights, they're like, don't hit the car, don't hit the car, don't hit the car. And then they hit the car because they're impaired. They're focusing on the negative and they're drawn to that.
Yeah.
These athletes are the same way. Like, I hit a ball into the net, I'm going to hit a ball into the net, and then they hit the ball into the net because they're thinking of the negative, and your brain will actually make that true. It will make true what you believe.
I love mindset, but also the visualization of what you want to achieve is so critical. So critical.
Yeah.
The other thing that you brought up there that I think a lot of times in careers and in life that people look past is, that coach, that mentor, right? We talk about youth sports all the time. And, a lot of times as a kid, if you're playing volleyball, right, you come off and you have someone like yourself, right, that can create that perspective for them of, you're not touching the ball, but here's the significant impact that you're having. And as so many times I've seen people in their careers, they're doing the same thing. They're part of a team and they're playing a role, and just, maybe it's sometimes in the culture that their teammates aren't bringing it up, but, even if they don't, it's a lot of times if they have that outside mentor or coach to be able to just give them that perspective of what is their value and what is, and in some cases, are they on the right track or wrong track? Right. So, if I'm sure that player, if all of a sudden she would have flipped to, I'm not going to pass it anymore. I'm not going to be that deep. I'm just going to spike it every time.
Right.
Right. Because there's plenty of kids that have wanted to do that because I want the glory. Well, then that would have been a different discussion.
Well, I think, in the business world, just like on the court, on the field or whatever, we undervalue what we're inherently good at because it doesn't feel like we're working. It doesn't feel like we're contributing. Like, when I'm on a stage speaking, that's playtime for me. Like, that's not hard. That's not stressful. It's just fun. And the fact that somebody pays me for that sometimes feels weird, right? The fact that somebody else ascribes value to something that I feel like I was wired to do. This girl was wired to be a defensive specialist. Of course she doesn't feel special about that because it just feels like a day in the office, right? It just feels like something I do. But when somebody can't do what she does or wants to do what she does, they're watching her and they're taking notes. And she probably couldn't even tell them how she does it. It's just something in her that's built that way. All these athletes today talk about, I'm built different. Some of them are. Like, they couldn't describe to you how they're doing what they're doing because they're just inherently good at it. And so they undervalue it. In the business world, just because you're really good at something doesn't diminish its value. It actually increases the value.
Yeah. Well said.
So, Scott, since we are on the subject of youth sports, for those younger individuals listening to the show, I wonder, what can you tell someone who is a young athlete, maybe aspiring to be great at something like their sport that they're in? What would you tell them to help them either maintain or develop greater skills? Because I think any sport, I don't care what sport you want to talk about, mindset and the visualization, this whole conversation around communication is more critical than any young person will understand, at least until they get to be about our age.
Right. I tell, both of my daughters played volleyball. Both of my daughters are relatively small. Like, my youngest is like 5'1". She's 18. She's like 5'1". So they were defense specialists. They were back row players. And when they tried out in middle school, like, they were the smallest of the people trying out. And so I told them what I would tell any athlete today. There's going to be people better than you. Every day there's going to be people better than you. Don't let anybody outwork you, right? Go out there and hustle, do the work, be coachable. When the coach tells you something, it's okay. It's not, but I was just like, that's a frustration of mine when an athlete wants to explain why don't explain to me in the moment. Later we can talk about it. Just, okay, coach. But don't let anybody outwork you. Be the hardest working person out there. Be the most coachable. Be the most encouraging to your teammates, because that translates to success. Emmanuel Quickley, who played for UK a couple of years ago, not a standout player. Good guy, good player, got drafted in the NBA, and the ESPN analyst said, Emmanuel Quickley's a good locker room player. Like, he's the guy that's going to organize the Bible study. He's going to encourage the players. He's going to be a positive force. He's now turned into a scoring machine for the NBA. Like, the kid just plays. But he didn't have that when he got drafted. Yeah. But he was a good positive influence with a good work ethic, and that got him through the door. And then he outworked everybody. So there's always going to be somebody more talented than you. You're not Steph Curry. You're just not. You're never going to be Steph Curry. So just work harder than Steph Curry works.
That's awesome. One of the things that I tell my teenager, in addition to some of those things, is be visible, because the coaches can't always see you. They're not always in the locker room. Some of them are, some of them aren't. But it's amazing how many of them know when you're in the locker room, when you're in the weight room, when you're at these extracurriculars. Maybe it's volunteering to do some coaching for a camp or something, and they see your body of work, and that is part of how they evaluate you. So if you're looking to be an aspiring player, you've got to be available, you've got to be visible. Otherwise, they're going to make those assumptions we talked about in the beginning of the show, and they're probably not going to be good, right?
Yeah.
Or not as good as you could have made it.
The analogy I use, and I didn't make this up, I heard it from somebody, but I can't remember who, is the difference between a thermometer and a thermostat. Like, a thermometer only tells you what the temperature is. A thermostat sets the temperature. And there are players who, I would tell them this, they're like, I don't know if I want to play in college. I'm like, listen, your stat sheets will never show the type of player you are. Because when you step onto the court, the whole game changes. The girls are more energized. They rally around you. Like, you are a game changer, and there's no place on the stat sheet for that. So be that player. Be the player who's the thermostat, but not the thermometer. There are some girls who allow other girls to take them out. Some athletes, well, their teammate gets frustrated, so they'll go out with them. Those are thermometers. Like, they're just reflecting the temperature that's on the court or the field. Go out there and set that temperature, because coaches look for that. They look for people who have stuff that won't show up on a stat sheet, because those are the players that the other recruiters aren't necessarily looking at. Recruit for character and teach skill. That's true in sports, and that's true in the business world. If you have a really good character and a really good work ethic, I'll teach you what you need to know.
Excellent.
That's an absolute bomb and a great way to wrap up this conversation. Scott, just a recap of anything you would love listeners to take away from this conversation, or just some parting thoughts.
I think my biggest frustration today in our cancel culture world is people telling us the things that we can't talk about. And to me, those are the things that are spiraling out of control, because people are afraid to talk about them. So I actually encourage people to have uncomfortable, safe conversations, which means you have to sit down face to face with somebody. This doesn't happen on social media. Sit down face to face with somebody, asking good questions, actively listening to their responses, and saying, this is going to be awkward. Like, I don't want to offend you. I'm not going to purposefully offend you. If I do say something offensive, please let me know. Give me the permission to say the wrong thing, so that together we can get to the right conclusion. Because I've had plenty of awkward conversations with people that once we push past the awkward, we find the awesome on the other side. But if we would have pushed against the awkward and turned away, we never get to the awesome. So have those conversations, be open to changing your mind, and don't make things off, where we can't talk about them. They're not off limits.
Another absolute bomb. I love it. Scott, I wish we would have had more time for a longer conversation, but this was amazing, very insightful, and something I think all of our guests, including Dustin and I, can take away. I think communication is a greatly underrated tool in our toolbox, and I can't wait to go through and listen to this again. So thank you for being on the show. But before we let you go, can you tell the audience more about where they can find you and what you have going on?
Yeah, they can find all of the things I'm doing at speakingofharvey.com. That's kind of home base. If they want to find out about the book, silencekillsbook.com has a book trailer but it's also available Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million online. Very few of them are carrying it in the stores because everything is in the online world, but it's all over the place. SilenceKillsBook.com will tell you more about it, but I'm pretty easy to find online. If you want to connect with me and learn more or question what I said, I could have been wrong. So I would love to hear your input.
When does the audiobook come out?
They're saying, the publisher says usually 6 months after the initial release. They like to do a second release, so we'll start talking about that soon, hopefully. We just released April 18th to the public, so we're not even a month old yet.
Amazing. So cool. Can't wait to go check that out. We'll put a link to the book in the show notes, so be sure to check that out. To our audience today, thank you so much for your ears. We appreciate your time and tuning in. Until next time, we'll see you. Peace.
Thank you for being part of the Hustle Nation. If you're serious about raising the bar in your personal and professional life and willing to go all in on your success, head over to hustleleaders.com. Here you can get access to our Hustle Productivity ebook, attend our Hustle Masterclass, or challenge yourself to the 30-day Hustle Challenge. Pairing these tools and training with the Hustle Nation podcast will help you advance to a whole new level. Until next time, stay hungry and inspire those around you to hustle.